with the fact that this is information that's current as of today. So things changed a lot in immigration law, for those of you who are perhaps watching this recorded, especially. So tonight I'm going to speak a bit about the different presidential proclamations that are still in effect, and the travel restrictions that would be particularly applicable to Italian citizens if you leave the United States and seek to come in, and then some potential national interest exemptions. So a waiver, if you do need to leave the United States and you're subject to a proclamation, how can you potentially return to the United States? So I did prepare some slides tonight because there is a lot of information. So I'm going to go through the slides and this, the different proclamations and waivers. And then at the end, like Francesca said, I'm happy to take any questions to clarify anything, or, I'd prefer not to get to too super specific questions. Try to, if I can definitely talk to you another time offline if you have a very specific situation yourself. But if it's a question that, others could benefit from, feel free to ask. So to get started with my slides, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay, here we go. This is good. Okay, so let me type this. Okay, so in 2020, we have several COVID-19 related travel and visa restrictions, and they all still do remain in effect. The end date on most or not all of them is December 31st of this year. We don't know if they're going to be extended or not, given that COVID is still very much a global threat. This could be extended. Whether through the current administration and potentially into the next administration. So each of these proclamations either suspends travel or the issuance of certain new visas. And they do only apply to people who are outside of the United States, or if you're in the United States, you're planning on traveling internationally during this validity of the proclamation. And it's important to remember that each proclamation is independent from one another. So if somebody, for example, maybe is exempt from the June proclamation on HJL visas, they still could be subject to one of the country's specific COVID-19 travel ban proclamations. And as I go on, you'll understand a little bit more about this. But, if the first part of it would be if you needed to get a new visa in one of these categories. And the second part would be if you travel to Italy, for example, a Schengen country, and you have one of these visas and you're trying to come back into the United States. And then a kind of a final comment on this slide would be to remember, and we've seen quite a bit of this in Italy, for example, is that even if you do get a visa appointment, for example, the embassy and the consulates do close all of a sudden, sometimes because perhaps there's been a COVID-19 outbreak, or somebody was there who had COVID and they just closed everything down. We did get this for one of my clients who had a visa appointment scheduled in Rome, and all of a sudden you get this email, we've canceled your appointment for tomorrow because the embassy is closed due to a COVID outbreak. So then you've got to kind of regroup and get another appointment. So it's never really a guaranteed thing until you've had the appointment. So moving on to the next slide, what are the presidential proclamations? There are different ones, there's not just one. And these, maybe wouldn't be applicable to all of you, but remember, it's not necessarily like the China travel proclamation. It's not necessarily if you're Chinese, but if you're, say, Italian and you need to go to China for some work reason and you're trying to come back in, you would be subject to the China travel proclamation. And basically that one would state that you could not travel back to the United States directly from China. There is this 14-day period. So what some of people that I know have gone to Mexico, for example, for 14 days and then flown back to the US. but unless you're able to get a waiver. So that's if you can't get a waiver. And then Iran is a similar situation if you happen to be traveling to Iran. And the one I think that would most concern everybody on this call tonight is the European Schengen Proclamation. Again, unless you're subject to one of the exemptions, and I'll go over those in a second, or you can get a waiver, and you have a non-immigrant visa, you have an O, you have an H, you have an L, and you can't get a waiver, you are going to be subject to this Schengen Proclamation, and you cannot travel directly back to the United States. So you'd have to perhaps go for 14 days to another country if you can't, if you have to come back to the US and you can't get a waiver. Ireland and UK are similar, Brazil as well. And then Canada and Mexico is interesting because there is this ban on travel, but unless it's non-essential, unless it is essential, but it only applies to land borders. So you can fly to Mexico, for example, and come back and not be subject to this particular ban. Canada, if you're flying to Canada, of course, Canada as a country has its own 14-day quarantine period if you're going there. So that's, it's different whether you're traveling by land or by air for Canada and Mexico.
Meredith, sorry to interrupt. Do you mind doing a full screen show?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, next one, the next one more over, on your right. It's that one.
Ah, okay. I'm sorry, everybody. Now you have a full screen. Okay, great.
Better now, thank you.
Okay, so the next slide then I had mentioned exemptions. So who would not have these proclamations? Who would not have to worry about these? So if you're a US citizen or you have your green card, you're not subject to the proclamations. If you're the spouse or a child under the age of 21 of a US citizen or lawful permanent resident, you would be subject. If you're the sibling, if you're the brother or sister, but both have to be unmarried and under the age of 21, and then the parents, so only if the US citizen is unmarried and under 21, if you're a member of the armed forces, if you're being requested by the US government to come to the United States, or something to do with law enforcement or, DHS. And then, of course, like I had mentioned, anybody who would be deemed in the national interest. And I'm going to talk about how you could potentially get a waiver under national interest. Now, so the proclamation, there's going back to the difference in the proclamations, some are country specific, some are specific to certain visa classifications. So the proclamation that was issued in June does suspend entry for H-1B, so who didn't have a valid visa and were outside of the United States on June 24th. So that would be, H-1Bs, Js, and Ls. And then unless those people are able to get a national interest waiver, they're supposedly not able to get new visas. So that is something to keep in mind. For example, we have some clients who were hired by US companies under the H-1B cap lottery this past year. They were approved, but they are Italian, for example, and they have not been able to get new H-1B visas because this proclamation is in effect. They were outside of the United States on that date in June, and they did not have a valid H visa, of course. So they have to wait until the proclamation has been lifted. So the waivers, there are certain exemptions, namely students traveling from the Schengen area, the UK, Ireland, who have valid F1 or M1 visas are exempt. And then new students who are applying for new F1, M1 visas will automatically be considered for a national interest waiver. There's a little bit of a caveat with that one because as some of you who are in academia may be aware, it does depend on whether the school has a fully remote, if you have a fully remote course load, you will not be getting a visa. But if you can show at least a hybrid or that your school is meeting in person, or at least some in person, you could potentially get a new F1 or an M1 visa. Other exemptions would be, for business, regular business travel, certain investors. It's really, and I kind of want to stress that it's very case specific, and unfortunately a quite discretionary process. This, in some cases, this national interest exemption, asking for these. So of course, we see these granted more often if there's some even tangential relation to COVID-19, the work that the person is doing, even if maybe the person themselves is not doing, but the company is involved in some COVID-19 efforts, that would definitely be worth mentioning when requesting the waiver. And then of course, national security is a big one. Other exemptions, like I said, COVID-19 research, of course, public health. Also in this third bullet point is supposed to be, but we found it's a bit difficult. If you're resuming ongoing employment in the US in the same position with the same employer and the same visa classification, you should get an exemption. Sometimes we have to press a little harder on that one. H1, if you're in H1B status, senior level people are generally fine. If we can show the importance of your work to the economic recovery. And I have found in the past maybe couple of months, this has opened up a little bit. I think it also depends on the post. Certain countries we know are better to deal with than others. Certain embassies or consulates, Italy is a little bit tough sometimes, just to get a response. L1A and L1B, these are, the L1A would be senior level folks, L1B technical experts. So showing that this is a critical business need. And that takes perhaps a little bit of creativity and thought. Important to note is that when you are requesting a national interest exemption, and I'll go through what the process would be, you're supposed to request it first from the embassy or the consulate in the country where you are. And you kind of get one shot at it. So you want to be very careful on how you are requesting that. And perhaps have somebody take a look at it before you send it in, because they won't keep taking multiple requests from you if you get denied once. And then the last bullet point is for dependents. So if you're the spouse or child of if you're an H4, L2, or J2, you should be exempt. Now for Italy, I'm sure if you're considering traveling to Italy and you'd be seeking re-entry to the United States, you've perhaps already seen this, but there is a good PDF on the US Embassy in Italy website, and where you email is dependent on where you live in Italy, or where you're staying, where your primary residence is. So you would be emailing one of these email addresses ahead of time. And this is not just for people who need a new visa, but this is also for if you already have a visa and you need to travel back to the United States. You need to first try to contact the embassy or the consulate. And then if they are taking too long, you can then approach CBP, Customs and Border Protection, at the port of entry. So whether that be Boston Logan, JFK, Newark, and every port of entry has a slightly different procedure for requesting this permission. So unfortunately, we have had people who have not been aware. They've gone to Italy or whatever, they're seeking to come into the United States from Italy. And they call us and say, we can't check in for our flight, and they don't know why. You'll be put on a do not fly list. You won't be able to check in. If for some reason you're allowed to check in, you won't be able to board the airplane to come back in unless you have this advance permission from either the embassy or consulate, or if they're taking too long, you are allowed to directly email CBP and let them know you've already contacted, but you're traveling on such and such a date. And here's the reason for your waiver request and your request to enter the United States. I have gotten a lot of questions recently from people who want to travel for the holidays, but they want to be assured that they will be granted this waiver when they come back. Unfortunately, the Department of State has been very clear in recent weeks that they will only accept these national interest requests for people who are outside of the United States. So they don't want to hear from you if you're here and you're just trying to get advance permission and understand that you will be able to come back in. So it is risky. You're not guaranteed because you'll already be outside the United States when you're asking for this. So like I said, every port of entry has a different procedure. I've just this is for CBP in Boston, at Boston Logan. But they're all kind of similar, but of course there's a different email address for all of them. But they like I said, want you to contact the U.S. Embassy. If the embassy doesn't respond, then you have to show proof to CBP Boston that, save the email, attach it, that you did try, and don't do it the night before. Leave some time. And then Boston, says they want these bullet points, this information from you when you do submit your request. And Boston is pretty good, normally within like 4 to 5 days max. They'll get back to you. And, if you have a justified reason, and in most cases, we can, it can be framed in such a way to highlight, the critical nature of your job or your reason for needing to be back in the United States, then that would be granted. And if you're traveling with family members, you would need to make sure to include their information on the request. And of course, they're traveling with you under your request. So that's important. Okay, so those are my slides. I know that's kind of a lot of information quickly, but I think that the key takeaways here are to really understand that there is a risk if you're not a U.S. citizen, if you don't have your green card, or you're not the spouse or child of one of those. We can never guarantee anything, but like in all likelihood, if it's framed correctly, you should be able to return to the United States. And like I said, these proclamations are in effect till the end of the year. They could be extended, or they could maybe not be extended. So that remains to be seen. So